Well, hey, my name is Warren Ratliff. I'm the CEO of AdaptX. I appreciate AWS inviting me to speak today and appreciate you guys taking the time to listen. I want to talk to you about how you can empower your clinical leaders to transform equity, capacity, and quality by leveraging the real-world data that's in your EMR. Before I do that, I want to just talk a little bit of background. So we've all spent the last 10 or 15 years digitizing data. And we've done amazing things implementing EMRs. We've collected the data, we've got people entering that data every day. But if you're a clinician, if you're a clinical leader, it's a huge struggle to actually use that data to evaluate what's happening across patients. They just don't have the visibility that you would expect in any other industry. We don't even have the visibility on the clinical side that you would have, say, on the financial side of a hospital. So if you're a clinical leader, it becomes incredibly difficult to tell the difference between change and improvement. And if you can't tell when you're making an improvement, it's really hard to enlist your clinicians in making changes and transforming care. So at AdaptX, what we do is we make it easy for your clinical leaders, your frontline clinicians, your administrators to be able to use data to answer questions across patients. Self-serve, on the fly, without needing the intervention of anybody else. When you can do that, when you can answer your own questions in 30 seconds, then you can manage the clinical side of your hospital in some radically new ways. You can make improvements, you can make transformation at scale and at speed. So a couple of quick examples before I dive in further. Here's a surgery center that used AdaptX to become the first ever opioid-free surgery center in the country. They're able to move at a speed that they never had before. Instead of looking at their protocols every 5 or 10 years, they could look every few weeks, and they were able to enlist their physicians in doing the best practice, things that work. So they went from 95% of their patients getting an opioid to practically none. So what? Well, when you think that 7% of patients in surgery wind up being persistent users, it's a really big deal. That's a real change in quality. You also spend at a typical hospital a couple of $1 million a year on complications that come from opioids in surgery. So a huge impact. Another quick example, again, from the OR, this is actually from a large GI practice where they're doing thousands of endoscopies. What you're looking at is the late time per case. They're running 25 minutes late per case. In just a few weeks, they're able to surface best practices, actually enlist their clinicians in making a change, and you can see they're running 13 minutes early. Again, why does that matter? I think we can all agree that physician burnout, nurse burnout is a big deal. It costs money, it affects care. But by creating that kind of capacity, they're also able to end on time and add $6 to $8 million of additional cases, which just drops straight to the bottom line. One more quick example from equity. Here you're looking at time to TPA, a critical medication for stroke. And in just minutes, the medical director is able to determine that she has a huge disparity based on race, that African Americans in her trauma center are receiving TPA 20 minutes slower than average. And even better, she's able to then break down what happened and do something about it. So why can't all hospitals do this now? Right? What's slowing us down? The data's there, we know the data's there, we've done the work to get the data in the right place. Well, the problem is this. The problem is that it's incredibly hard to scale a system in which you're doing manual analysis. So at any hospital in the country, if you've got a clinical leader, a frontline doc, a perioperative leader, an administrator with a question, they put a ticket in and they wait. And there's no hospital around that's got enough analysts. These are hard to find folks, they're bright folks, there's not enough of them. So there's a wait. And even once you engage, they're not clinicians, so there's a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of confusion about what the question is. Then they go off and do data mining. Maybe they get a data engineer to look at the warehouse or look at the reporting layer of your EMR, and they come back with a spreadsheet. It's never right the first time, and the analyst will tell you that the clinician always changes the question. So this is a simplified version of what happens, and when I talk to health systems around the country, the quickest I've ever heard that people can expect to get an answer is 6 to 9 months. More often I hear 12 months, or never. So if you're a clinician, you've got to run this gauntlet to be able to answer a question, you're just not going to bother for most things. It's just not practical. So what you do is you manage your clinical operations based on anecdote, based on instinct. And that's not really going to enable you to transform care. So what do? Well, again, we make it easy for you to get actionable answers by leveraging data that's already in your system. If you've got a clinician who can run Airbnb, they can run our system. They don't need to be a super user, they don't need to be a data scientist, they don't need to be a data miner. The idea is to make it truly self-serve, so now you can leverage that data to manage the things that you care about and be able to do it really very quickly. If you can do that for one or two questions, you can quickly do it across operations. So we have what we call mission control, which again is self-populated. The physician, the clinical leader can on their own be able to look at the things that matter to them, vector and velocity, and really be able to manage day by day to be able to drive improvements. So again, what does that mean? Well, it means this. This is the core thing that you're able to do, which is adaptive clinical management. If you look at the left side of this wheel, every hospital I know of does this work already. You have to, if you're going to make a change, you have to strategize, you have to plan, you have to execute. But even during COVID, we get to stop executing. But if you think about changes that happened at your hospital, a new medication, a new protocol, a new workflow, when was the last time you're able to say, okay, these next 5 patients, were they better than the last 100? Or then is the next week better than the last year? To really be able to look and see, are you getting better? Are you getting worse? So with AdaptX, you're able to look every day, every week, every month, understand what's happening, adapt. So you can make rapid change, and so you can also enlist the clinicians across the system to be able to make those changes. So how do we do that? I'm going to shift to a demo in a second, but just one sort of semi-technical slide. This is super easy for us to get into AWS and be able to get to work. A typical implementation for, say, the OR is 4 weeks, because all we need to do is take a simple data extract, just a CSV file, out of your EDW ideally, but you could take it out of the reporting layer, and then we're off to the races, able to work on our system. So now to the fun part. I want to show you actually how the system works and how a clinician is able to use it themselves to be able to leverage all the great work that the analysts and the IT teams have done in digitizing this data. So I want to start with equity. How could you really look and diagnose real problems and find actionable answers in equity? If you think about it with your hospital right now, do you know, down to a procedure level, whether everyone is getting equitable care and having equitable outcomes? How would you figure this out? So this is an example from a large ED where they're very proud of the stroke care that they deliver. And so here the medical director is actually going into our ED module, and you see a set of filters. Again, looks a little bit like Airbnb. We're going to pick a date, pick a house on the beach, dog friendly. Well, here we're going to pick some dates. We're going to pick a couple years of data. And you can see this is a really large facility, right? There's a whole bunch of patients. And then I'm just going to pick all the stroke patients. I just want to take them all. Here we go. Not too hard so far. I'm just going to name that cohort so I can find it later. And then there's going to be a whole bunch of metrics that I could choose to look at. They're just there at my fingertips. In this case, what I know is time to TPA, right? The physicians say time is brain. If you need to get TPA, you need to get it as quickly as you can possibly get it. So what is that? Now in this facility, they have measured time to TPA as a key metric, but traditionally the medical director got that answer 90 days later. Not an actionable time. She can know how she did. Great, so here we go. So there you've got, we looked at how many thousand patients, and there's the answer, right, at her fingertips. How long did it take? 30 seconds? And I don't know if you can read it from where you're sitting, but you're looking at about 32 minutes, nice and stable, right? We're able to tell you what the variation in that is. So that's national leading. That's in the top, say, quarter for EDs, something to be really excited about. We actually had the medical director doing this as part of her training. So this is actually what she did in the first 5 minutes when we turned the system on for her and gave her a login. And then she took over and said, hey, can I look at performance of my system by race? I've always wondered. I said, sure. You could actually look by anything you want to. You could look by any sort of demographic. You could look by payer class. You could look by age. You could look by race. You could by language. So that's what she's doing. And here's what she found. Now what the dots represent are racial groups. On the right-hand side, there's a funnel plot. So on the right-hand side, you've got the groups that you've got the most patients. On the left, the fewest. And she was stunned to find that her African-American patients were receiving their TPA 20 minutes later than the average for the rest of her patients. She had no idea. She was devastated. It was obviously very upsetting to find out. But now she knew. So she went to her leadership team, shared this information, and they said, you know, we got to break that down. Nobody shows up to the ED with a Post-it note on their forehead that says, I'm having a stroke, give me TPA. You got to get to a bed, you got to get to a provider, you got to get a CT scan. So they broke it down in AdaptX. You got to get to each of those stages. And then again, on the right, they pivoted, stratified by race. And what they found was, it took their African-American patients 5 minutes longer to get to a bed, right? Longer to get to a physician, even longer to get the CT scan. So is it really surprising it took them longer to get their medication? It's really upsetting to look at, but now it's actionable. Now I've broken it down to a level where I can begin to look for what are my best practices, I can put resource against these things, and then I can look at it every day in mission control and say, am I getting better, is it working, or am I getting worse? I don't have to put together some partnership. I can fix this in the four walls of my hospital. And the great news is, this is where they landed 90 days later. So you can see again on the left, they have this delay of 20 minutes. On the right, they've got their African-American patients getting care at the same speed, and in fact, the average has gone down. Everybody's getting, on average, better care. So here we're looking at a particular area. We're looking at TPA for stroke. If you wondered, hey, what if I didn't know where to start, right? In my hospital, I don't know. Where would I start? Well, I want to give a shout out to AWS, who's given us a huge amount of support in delivering what I want to show you just really quickly. It's called Equity Manager. So it just flashed by. We just said, hey, show me all the patients in my OR, thousands of patients. Oh, do I have any equity issues? It took just that long. And now we're looking at stratification across all of the OR, and I can see where my outliers are. I can dive in. Now I'm diving in here to say, let me look at orthopedics. If we had time, I could go down to the physician level, to the procedure level, to the nurse level. I could look between facilities, and now I can really figure out how I could action those things across equity. I'm going to shift gears for a moment because I know we've got limited time and talk about efficiency. Again, we've all digitized our hospitals. So here you're looking at an OR. I don't know if people have spent time in an OR, but you can see all these different stations where you've got 4 different people entering data. Well, if you've been in an OR, what you're seeing here is the surgery prep time. Right? It's not value added time. The surgeon's not cutting. You got a data, you got a technician, right? You've got a nurse, you got an anesthesiologist. They got to position the patient. They got to secure the patient. They got all the equipment in the right place. They got to enter all of that. They got to do a timeout. So I've sped this up, but in real life, this took 13 minutes. And now they've got it down to 6. Like, how did they do that? What do they do? Well, you've got all the data, but you've got those people clicking buttons, right? They're entering the data. It's in the EMR. They just don't have any way to actually access it and utilize it. So here, this is actually from the chief of urology surgery. What he did was he looked first at, hey, what's my baseline performance in my system? So looking across all my surgeons, it's about 13, 14 minutes. Then he wondered, well, do I have any positive deviants? Do I have any outliers? Has anybody cracked the code? And again, in this chart, these are all surgeons. On the right, you've got the folks who've done the most. On the left, the folks who've done the least. He's actually the guy on the far right. He figured, I am the chief, I do the most. I'm going to be the best. I'm going to be the best on this metric. Well, it turns out there are 2 people that are a whole lot faster than him and who don't have any downsides in their practice. So he pulled this aside and asked, hey, what do you do? Followed him, watched a couple of procedures. Then he implemented himself. This is his prep time. Huge difference. And the system is pulling out with the AI, hey, you've got a real change. So he took it to his team and said, if I can make this change and I'm the chief, can you make the change? Well, it turns out they could make the change too, and he could enlist them in doing it because as a leader, he was making the change, and because he could show them the data from their own system. Not some benchmark from across the country, but from within their own system. What's the best practice? And when they did that, they got this. So they went from 70 cases a month to 90 cases a month, which meant they made another $3 million. No change in the staffing, that just dropped straight to the bottom line. And here he is managing it. Right? Now he's looking at it every day, every week, managing these metrics that actually matter to him and to his team. And then his hospital actually took the same approach across the hospital and added 100,000 minutes to their OR last year. Just 2 quick last slides. Without going into detail, there is a huge amount of technology that undergirds all of this, that brings you the power and that also makes it easy. It's all hosted in AWS. But for your clinical users, they don't need to understand any of that. They just look at that top line. For them, it's just a self-service management layer that's sitting on top of the EMR that you've already deployed and the data that you've already built. For the clinician users, what matters is it's an enterprise self-service solution that whatever part of the hospital they're in, whatever part of the health system, they now have the power to be able to look at their data, answer the questions they care about, and manage to their priorities. Thank you. I appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk about how you can maximize the value of your EMR.